Welcome to The Scoop, NANP's monthly educational webinar series. I am your host, Andrea Granson. These webinars are recorded and everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording. NANP members can earn 1 continuing education credit for participating in Scoop webinars by taking the corresponding quiz, which can be found in the membership area of the NANP website. Today's webinar will conclude with a question and answer session, so feel free to type in your questions as we go along so that we can get to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. Today, our guest presenter is Chris Kresser, the co-director of the California Center for Functional Medicine, founder of the Kresser Institute, creator of chriskresser.com, and the New York Times best-selling author of The Paleo Cure. He is one of the most respected clinicians and educators in the fields of functional medicine and ancestral health, and has trained over 1,500 clinicians and health coaches around the world in his unique approach. Chris was named one of the 100 most influential people in health and fitness by Greatist.com and has appeared as a featured guest on Dr. Oz, Fox and Friends, and in other national media outlets. His new book, Unconventional Medicine, presents a 3-step plan for reinventing healthcare and reversing chronic disease using functional medicine, an ancestral diet and lifestyle, and a collaborative practice model. Chris lives in Berkeley, California with his wife and daughter. Welcome, Chris, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrea and Shannon, and all of the other folks at NANP for inviting me to this webinar. So should we dive in?
Yeah, we're excited. Yes, let's go. Yeah.
All right, great. So hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. And I'm really happy to be presenting on this topic because it's something I've been interested in for many years and I think is becoming increasingly relevant. We're seeing a lot more discussion about iron and the role of iron in metabolic disease. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of this with you. So I want to start with a case study. It was a 34-year-old male that we'll call David. Came to see me several years ago. He was a former Division I college football player, and he was at that time competitive in CrossFit. He had started a paleo type of diet about a year and a half before he came to see me, and he felt great. And then about 9 months into it, he started to feel a little bit worse. He was getting tired, his joints were starting to hurt, he was having some palpitations, his libido dropped, he had some brain fog, memory issues, and he was seeing some blood sugar issues, which was totally bizarre for him since he was, an athlete, competitive athlete, and he was eating a really clean diet. So before David had come to see me, he saw 6 different doctors, and he was diagnosed with everything from depression to adrenal fatigue to hormone imbalance, and unfortunately, none of these treatments worked. So I ran a full panel, including several markers for iron, and I discovered that David had iron overload. Then we did some genetic testing and found that David had 1 gene polymorphism that is associated with hereditary hemochromatosis, and we're going to talk more about what all of this means later. When he took those results back to his primary care doctor, the doctor dismissed the importance of them because conventional wisdom holds that you have to have 2 copies or 2 polymorphisms in these genes in order to experience any of the adverse effects of hereditary hemochromatosis or iron overload. And so he was told he did not have that condition and that there was therefore nothing to worry about. Unfortunately, David's story is not unique. Hemochromatosis is a very common genetic disease. Its prevalence is about 1 in 200, which is 10 times that of cystic fibrosis. And it is associated with significant morbidity and mortality. Yet few people have heard of it, and most doctors are not looking for it. Hemochromatosis is often misdiagnosed or simply just missed entirely. A 1996 CDC survey found that 12% of people with hemochromatosis received a psychiatric diagnosis, and nearly 20% were given iron, which is extremely dangerous in a condition that's characterized by aggressive iron storage. Patients with hemochromatosis usually see an average of 3 doctors and wait an average of 9 years before they are diagnosed. And this is definitely consistent with my experience. Over the 10 years I've been in practice, I've diagnosed several people with this condition, and none of them knew that they had it before they came to see me, with one exception, and they had likely had it for many years. Compounding the problem, even mild iron overload is associated with an increased risk of early death and disease. So it makes it really hard for patients like David to get adequate care. Even if the doctor does find slightly high iron levels, that they may be ignored. Iron is essential to life, and without it, most life on the planet would cease to exist. Plants would wither and die, and animals and humans would suffocate. Plants require iron to make chlorophyll, and humans require it to make hemoglobin and myoglobin. So hemoglobin is a protein that moves oxygen around in the body, and myoglobin stores oxygen in the muscles, which allows them to do work. Of course, iron has several important functions in the body. Other protein groups aside from hemoglobin and myoglobin contain heme and thus iron, including cytochromes that supply energy and proteins that are required for DNA synthesis and cell division. Iron is also needed to produce connective tissue, some neurotransmitters, and to maintain immune function. And there's no question that too little iron is a serious problem. It's much more common than excess iron or iron overload, especially worldwide. Iron deficiency and anemia still affect about 2 billion people worldwide, particularly in the developing world. And without enough iron, we become short of breath, we develop brain fog, extreme fatigue, and poor immune function. But what is less commonly known is that too much iron is also harmful, and in some cases even deadly. As little as 450 milligrams of iron can poison a small child. Too much iron from the diet or from supplements can accumulate and cause organ failure and death. And it literally causes organs to rest. So if you take a bite out of an apple and it turns brown, or you see a car resting, that is the oxidative damage or stress that is activated by iron that you're seeing there. And it can happen to the organs inside of our body. And the damage that is caused by iron is especially notable in the pancreas, the liver, the joints, the heart, and the many different structures of the brain. There are several known conditions that cause iron overload, and these include hereditary hemochromatosis, African siderosis, beta thalassemia, sickle cell anemia, alcohol abuse, and viral hepatitis, and then some more rare conditions like sideroblastic anemia, dysmetabolic iron overload syndrome, and enzymopathies like glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, or G6PD. Let's talk a little bit more about hereditary hemochromatosis, or HH as it's often referred to. So this is an autosomal recessive disorder involving a mutation of both copies of the HFE gene on chromosome 6. So autosomal recessive disorder means that 2 copies must be present in order for the disease to develop. And I take issue with this, and you'll see why shortly, but this is the sort of textbook definition of the condition. There are 2 major disease-causing mutations in classic hereditary hemochromatosis. One is the replacement of cytosine with tyrosine, which is C282Y mutation, and the second is the replacement of histidine with aspartic acid, which is the H63D mutation. But, and this is really important to understand, since the discovery of the C282Y mutation in the 1990s, at least 20 other mutations of the HFE gene have been characterized, but their effects on iron metabolism are still poorly understood. We've also discovered mutations in other genes that cause iron overload, including transferrin receptor 2, ferroportin 1, chromosome number 19, hepcidin, and CDA2, and these are also not well understood. Estimates on the prevalence of HH mutations vary from study to study. According to one large review published in the American Journal of Epidemiology, about 0.4% of the general population, or 1 in 200, are homozygous for C282Y, which means they have 2 copies of that mutated gene. Anywhere from 0% in Asia to 9% in Europe and North America are heterozygous for C282Y, meaning they have one copy. Roughly 1.5% of the general population is homozygous for H63D. From 5 to 22% of the population is heterozygous for H63D, and about 5% are what are known as compound heterozygotes for C282Y and H63D. That means they have one mutated copy of each of these two different genes. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, a common misconception is that heterozygous carriers of these mutations are not affected by iron overload. But recent research has shown that to be absolutely not true. There are several studies here in the table on this slide, and they've monitored the incidence of iron overload in carriers. And as you can see, elevated iron values are associated with many different diseases, the heterozygous carriers of these mutations do have elevated iron levels and increased risk of disease. So if you look at the first row there, with iron loading, 4 different studies found that heterozygous carriers of C282Y and compound heterozygotes had elevated ferritin and iron saturation. Heterozygotes for C282Y had high risk of death due from Vibrio vulnificus, an infection. The heterozygous carriers of various mutations had 2-fold higher risk of arthritis. Several studies on vascular disease, cancer, showing that heterozygous carriers had anywhere between 1.6 to 8.7 times the risk of cancer and CVD. And then one study showed that heterozygous carrier of C282Y had increased risk of mortality prior to the age of 65. So these are many studies documenting clear adverse effects from even in heterozygous carriers compared to people who have no mutations at all. Iron or transferrin saturation, which is also referred to as iron saturation, it's one measure of iron status, and this marker alone has been shown to predict mortality. So a study of 45,000 Danish individuals compared mortality according to baseline iron saturation levels. So they measured their iron saturation, early in the study, and they followed them for several years, and then they correlated that with their mortality risk. So cumulative survival was reduced in people who had iron saturation above 50% compared to those who had iron saturation below 50%. And as you can see, those with iron saturation above 80% had a 2.2-fold increased risk of mortality. It's been well known for some time that there's a long list of diseases associated with or worsened by hemochromatosis, like liver disease, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, and many other neurodegenerative and endocrine disorders. Also, things like asthma, IBD, lupus, psoriasis, cancer, hypoparathyroidism, epilepsy, restless leg syndrome, osteoporosis. I mean, the list really does just go on and on, because iron, as I mentioned earlier, causes oxidative damage and inflammation when it's in excess. And those are really the roots of most modern chronic disease. But what's less well known is that even high normal or mildly elevated iron overload is increased with morbidity. Mildly elevated iron indices and even iron levels within the normal lab range have been associated with metabolic, cardiovascular, and neurodegenerative problems. Several studies have found that iron overload is associated with diabetes and impaired glucose tolerance, and this is thought to involve several mechanisms. The accumulation of iron reduces insulin synthesis and secretion in the pancreas and decreases insulin sensitivity in the liver, and iron deposition in the muscle actually decreases glucose uptake because of the muscle damage that it causes. Other studies have shown that even high normal iron levels can disrupt glucose and insulin regulation. One study of about 1,000 Finnish men, insulin, glucose, and fructosamine concentrations, fructosamine is another marker of average blood sugar, increased as body iron stores rose. And they divided the study population into quintiles, 5 groups. And the increase in glucose and insulin was detected in the 2 highest quintiles for ferritin between 143 and 216, and those who had a ferritin level above 216. Now, keep in mind that the lab range for ferritin goes all the way up to 400 on most labs. So many of these patients who are seeing this increase in blood sugar are experiencing it at levels that are currently considered of levels of ferritin that are currently considered to be normal in, by most labs and in the conventional medical establishment. Other interesting lines of evidence include the observation that increased iron stores can predict the development of diabetes in prospective studies. Frequent blood donors have lower prevalence of diabetes than people who don't donate blood. Ferritin levels are correlated with conditions like hypertensive retinopathy, which is common, of course, in diabetics, and hypertension is characterized by a higher prevalence of iron overload. Of course, none of these studies or lines of evidence that I just mentioned establish that iron is causing any of those problems. However, there are studies that have shown that reduction of iron to normal levels restores glucose tolerance and insulin sensitivity. So one trial of 25 patients with high ferritin diabetes and no C282Y mutations was randomized into 2 groups. One group had 3 phlebotomies at 3-week intervals. So phlebotomy is a removal of blood, which is the typical treatment for iron overload. And the other group received no treatment. Now, the bloodletting group had decreased A1C and C-peptide levels, both of which reflect an improvement in blood sugar and increased insulin sensitivity when compared to the controls. And what was especially striking about this study is that the changes in insulin sensitivity persisted 1 year after the bloodletting, even though they didn't receive subsequent bloodletting after that. A study published in June of 2012 on 64 patients with metabolic syndrome found that phlebotomy decreased blood pressure, resting heart rate, fasting glucose, A1C, and the LDL-HDL ratio. The phlebotomy group also experienced a significant improvement in insulin sensitivity, although that effect was not statistically significant. This effect is not limited to individuals with diabetes or impaired glucose tolerance. Facchini et al. Found decreased post-load blood sugar and insulin concentrations 1 month after a single phlebotomy, even in healthy volunteers with normal glucose tolerance and ferritin levels. So again, even in people who don't have diabetes or blood sugar issues, if they have mildly elevated iron levels, phlebotomy has been shown to further improve their blood sugar. And Facchini et al. In another study found that iron depletion to near iron deficiency, or NID, as it's called, improved both fasting and post-load glucose with insulin and insulin sensitivity in a group of patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So even though they didn't have excess iron levels at baseline or genetic polymorphisms that are associated with iron overload, just reducing their iron considerably showed these improvements. So this doesn't suggest that everyone should reduce their iron levels to near deficiency, but he was trying to make a point about the relationship between iron and metabolic markers. Iron overload is also associated with cardiovascular disease. In one group of about 3,500 US adults, 27% had LDL levels above 160 milligrams per deciliter, and 1.64% had iron saturation levels above 55%. Now, here's the interesting thing. If only LDL or iron saturation was elevated, the relative risk of dying from atherosclerosis was 40% higher or 57% higher, respectively, 1.4 or 1.57, respectively. But if both factors were high, both iron saturation and LDL were elevated at the same time, then the relative risk jumped to 5.21. So that's a huge difference compared to each of those factors being elevated individually. So the probable mechanism or explanation for that is iron's role in oxidation, as I've said a few times now. So increased iron enhances the oxidation of lipids, especially free fatty acids. And increased free fatty acid oxidation reduces glucose uptake in muscle tissue and increases gluconeogenesis in the liver, which can lead to insulin resistance. And it's well established that iron is a powerful catalyst of free radical production, which contributes to the oxidative damage of those lipids. So if someone has high lipids without excess iron, that's one thing. But if they have high lipids and excess iron, then that creates a toxic environment where the iron is oxidizing those lipid cells and they become more dense and therefore more likely to damage the lining of the artery, which is the initial event of plaque formation and the beginning of atherosclerosis. At least one study has borne this out. They looked at 20 male patients with iron overload and then 20 sex and age matched controls that did not have iron overload. And those with iron overload had about 40% higher oxidized LDL levels than controls. They also had higher levels of other markers associated with cardiovascular disease, including CETP, Lp(PLA2), and reduced activity of antioxidant enzymes. Even people at high risk for cardiovascular disease who aren't iron overloaded may benefit from reducing iron. This study of 31 carbohydrate intolerant patients, these are people with either diabetes or impaired glucose tolerance with normal iron levels. They took this group and they, again, took them down to near iron deficiency using phlebotomy. And that led to, as you can see on the slide, significantly increased HDL, reduced fasting glucose, total and reduced total and LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and fibrinogen. And importantly, again, suggesting a causal relationship here, not just a correlation, these effects were largely reversed by a 6-month period of iron repletion that restored the patient's iron to normal levels. Some researchers now believe that iron explains the difference in rates of cardiovascular disease between men and women. So we've known for some time that premenopausal women have lower rates of heart disease than men and postmenopausal women. But this, for a long time, it was suspected that estrogen is what had the protective effect in premenopausal women, and then when they went into menopause, that was lost, and so they then developed similar rates of heart disease to men. But that never really explained why women's heart disease rates, premenopausal women's heart disease rates were lower than men, and why estrogen would have more of a protective effect in women than testosterone would in men. And as you know, when that theory was tested with HRT trials, it didn't work out as everyone thought it would. So in this iron hypothesis, the beneficial effect of iron depletion is what explains the difference in rates of heart disease between men and premenopausal women. So men begin a steady accumulation of iron in late adolescence, and the rate at which they accumulate iron will depend on their genetics and their diet and other factors. But women fail to acquire significant iron stores because of continual losses during menstruation each month, and then larger losses during childbirth. Diabetes, lupus, a history of preeclampsia, and PCOS all erase this premenopausal female advantage of heart disease rates. In other words, premenopausal women with these conditions have similar rates of heart disease to men. And what do all of these conditions have in common? Well, they're all associated with increased body iron stores. In addition to its effects on cardiovascular and endocrine systems, iron overload promotes oxidative stress and neuronal damage in the central nervous system. Brain iron levels tend to increase during normal aging, even without genetic mutations. And excessive iron deposits are found in the brain of patients with Parkinson's disease and in the neuritic plaques of patients with sporadic Alzheimer's disease. Pathological brain iron accumulation has been documented in other disorders of the central nervous system like multiple sclerosis, ALS, Huntington's disease, stroke, and cerebral hemorrhage. A clinical trial of the iron chelator desferrioxamine was given for 2 years to Alzheimer's patients and clearly slowed the clinical progression of dementia. Interestingly, iron's role in oxidizing LDL may be a common mechanism in the pathogenesis of both heart disease and neurodegenerative disorders. And this is especially true with people with the ApoE4 haplotype. ApoE4 is associated with both an increased risk of cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's disease, as I'm sure many of you know. And recent research has shown that ApoE4 is more susceptible to oxidative damage than ApoE2 and 3. So ApoE4 carriers are more vulnerable to the harmful effects of iron and have higher levels of oxidized LDL as a result. And this would explain both their higher rates of cardiovascular disease and the higher rates of Alzheimer's. Okay, let's talk a little bit about diagnosis of iron overload. Signs and symptoms include extreme fatigue. That is the most common sign of iron overload. And this is one of the reasons that this condition is often misdiagnosed. If you look at these symptoms, extreme fatigue, joint pain, impotence are the top three. And you can imagine a male going in to see their doctor, or a female for that matter, and they mention that these are their top three symptoms. Iron overload is probably going to be the last thing on most clinicians' mind. Skin bronzing is a little more revealing because it reflects liver damage, and that might prompt someone to do some studies of the liver, and they might find some markers that are elevated, and again, that might prompt further exploration. But most of these other symptoms, palpitations, depression, abdominal pain, are very nonspecific, which means they don't point to the pathology in any kind of specific or identifiable way. There are many blood tests that can be done to assess iron levels. It's important to note that serum iron, which is unfortunately the most common test that's included on a blood panel, is not a reliable marker and is not even often used by hematologists in the diagnosis of iron overload, and can actually be low in some patients with hereditary hemochromatosis. So you get a situation where doctors often not including any iron markers at all, but if they are, they might just be including serum iron, and that, as I've said, is not going to catch many people who do have iron overload. Transferrin saturation, which is also called iron saturation, measures the percentage of transferrin that is saturated with or bound to iron. Each molecule of transferrin, which is a protein that carries iron through the body, can bind with and carry 2 atoms of iron. And it will transport iron through the body fluids and withhold it from pathogens. So a normal value for iron saturation would be somewhere between 25 and 40%. And abnormal, at least according to the conventional lab range, would be either 50 or 55%, depending on the lab. And from what I've seen in the research, I think 45% is a more reasonable upper limit. Some have even argued for 40%, but clearly 55% is too high if you think back to the study that showed that there was an increase in mortality risk as iron saturation climbed above 50%. TIBC and UIBC are two other markers on a complete iron panel. TIBC measures the blood's capacity to bind transferrin with iron. That's total iron binding capacity. Unsaturated iron binding capacity, or UIBC, measures the remaining transferrin that's not being used to transport iron, and it's calculated by subtracting serum iron from TIBC. UIBC is actually much more reliable than TIBC. I would put TIBC just slightly lower than serum iron in terms of its uselessness. It's not completely useless at all. And even serum iron is not useless. That's probably the wrong word, but they're the least helpful of the iron markers, TIBC and serum iron. Whereas UIBC actually has a equal predictive power to iron saturation, according to many studies. The TIBC range is 250 to 450, and the UIBC range is 150 to 375. Now, these are the conventional ranges. I sometimes just narrow these a little bit. We don't have as much data on what a good functional range would be for these markers, but I look at them in the context of all of the other markers, and if someone is, at the bottom of the range, then that would suggest, even if they're not out of the range, that they might be a little bit iron loaded. So it's important to understand that these are inverse markers. So low TIBC or UIBC suggests high iron levels, and vice versa. Ferritin is the long-term storage form of iron. Nearly every cell in the body produces it. It's a huge molecule. One ferritin molecule can hold up to 4,500 atoms of iron. And the lab range for ferritin, as I mentioned earlier, goes up to about 400 on most labs in men. But the Iron Disorders Institute suggests an upper limit of 300 for men and 200 for women. And I think we could make an argument that the upper limit of ferritin should be around 150 in men, based on the studies suggesting decline in glucose tolerance as ferritin climbs above that level, and maybe something like 100, 125 for women. Be careful with assuming that elevated ferritin necessarily means iron overload. Ferritin is also what is known as an acute phase reactant, which is a type of protein that's elevated in the inflammatory response, like C-reactive protein. So if you see elevated ferritin with normal iron saturation and UIBC, you may be looking at inflammation instead of iron overload. One little known way to distinguish between inflammation and iron overload is a marker called soluble transferrin receptor. So this decreases with the decreased cellular need for iron, and unlike ferritin, it's not affected by inflammation. And I will just use the reported lab range for this marker, but again, if it's at the bottom of the range and all the other markers are pointing towards iron overload, I would still consider that to be abnormal. If a patient has elevated ferritin or iron saturation or UIBC or decreased low UIBC or low soluble transferrin receptor, again, those are inverse markers. Excuse me, I'm just going to get a drink of water. We'll retest. That's always the first step, because these markers can change quite a bit. They're transient things that can cause elevation. So for example, because transferrin saturation or iron saturation withholds iron from pathogens, if someone's exposed to a pathogen, you might see a temporary increase in iron saturation, then it will drop back down. So I retest, and then if they're again elevated, we'll do a genetic screen for hemochromatosis. LabCorp and many other labs offer this. The genes are also on panels like 23andMe. And these look for the three most common mutations in HFE, C282Y, and H63D, which we talked about before, and then another one called S65C, which is a lot less common than the other two. And these three mutations cover the majority of people with genetic polymorphisms that cause iron overload. I think it's about 90%, but not all. As I mentioned, many new mutations have been discovered, and we are not able to test for most of these outside of a research setting right now. I do recommend genetic testing because if you discover one of the common mutations that someone's homozygous, for example, for C282Y, then that will definitely inform the treatment and it will help the clinician and the patient plan for the future. But it's a mistake to assume that a negative genetic test means there's no problem. And I've seen this happen over and over, like I described with David at the beginning. It's also a mistake to assume that carriers, people who just have one polymorphism, are not at risk, not at a higher risk than non-carriers. And as we've seen, most studies show that carriers do have increased iron indices as well as increased risk of morbidity and mortality. It's not nearly as pronounced as it is when someone is homozygous or has two copies, and many carriers will never develop disease. But based on the available evidence, I think it makes sense to pay attention and be cautious. So here's an algorithm I put together a while back for some of the clinicians that I've trained in my practice and elsewhere. You test for the iron levels, and if iron saturation is above 45%, ferritin is above 200, you might make sure they're not taking supplemental iron or excess vitamin C. If you retest and the numbers are still high, then you go on to the HFE genetic testing. If they're not high, you might monitor yearly. If the HFE results are negative or they're a carrier, then blood donation and iron reduction protocol would be appropriate to maintain ferritin levels between 50 and 150 and iron saturation between 45%. If they are positive, then they should see a hematologist and be managed with more aggressive therapeutic iron reduction. Let's talk about prevention and treatment. The first question that people often ask is, should healthy people without iron overload limit iron in their diet? The body tightly regulates the absorption of iron, and most people will simply excrete excess dietary iron. So I don't think it's necessary or wise to limit the intake of iron-rich foods, especially because iron-rich foods are also rich in many other beneficial nutrients. That said, as we've seen, mutations that cause iron overload are quite common, and I do recommend that people avoid taking iron supplements unless they know that they need them from lab testing that has shown that they're deficient. And I recommend that people get a full iron panel with the markers that I've talked about, plus ferritin every couple of years to monitor their iron levels. And it may also be prudent, especially if you're a man or a woman that's in menopause, to donate blood 1 to 3 times a year in order to just prophylactically keep your iron stores low. But what do you do if you have excess iron? Well, there's only 2 ways to get rid of it once it has accumulated, and those are phlebotomy and chelation. So therapeutic phlebotomy, or the removal of blood, is the treatment of choice because chelation with drugs is only really used when the patient has simultaneous anemia and iron overload. Of course, in that case, you can't do removal of blood because you'll make the anemia worse, and chelation might be required there, but chelation can have very serious side effects when it's done with the drugs. That said, there is a natural chelator called lactoferrin, which can be a good alternative to drug chelation. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Therapeutic phlebotomy involves the removal of 1 unit or 500 cc of blood, and a unit of blood contains about 200 to 250 milligrams of iron. It's straightforward and safe. There's few risks if it's done properly, and a typical frequency for hemochromatosis patients these are people who have very high iron levels and have confirmed homozygous mutation, might be 1 to 2 times a week until ferritin reaches 25 nanograms per milliliter and hemoglobin gets down to 12.5. So that's getting them all the way down to near iron deficiency, or NID. And then once that happens, they usually go on to more of a maintenance schedule, like 1 unit of blood withdrawn every 8 weeks to maintain ferritin in the range of 50 to 150 and iron saturation below 40%. Phlebotomy, it can also be done though for people who have iron overload but don't have hereditary hemochromatosis. And you can do this without a doctor's prescription by just donating blood, Red Cross or local hospital. They'll remove the same 1 unit of blood, just like in therapeutic phlebotomy. But in this case, the maximum frequency is every 59 days. So if someone needs more frequent blood phlebotomy than that, then in order to maintain normal levels, they'll have to get a prescription from the doctor. So that frequency is enough for most people who don't have, hemochromatosis and significant iron overload. Unfortunately, phlebotomy is not an option for some people. People, as I mentioned, people with anemia, hemoglobin under 12.5 won't be able to donate blood. If you go to the Red Cross, they'll actually test your hemoglobin before they take your blood to make sure that they're not going to, make existing anemia worse. People who lived in the UK during the 80s and 90s, and I think that through the early aughts, are not allowed to donate blood in the US because of concerns about mad cow. Some states prevent people with tattoos from donating blood. And in these cases, the natural iron chelator lactoferrin can be used. So animals and humans both produce lactoferrin. It's present in secretions that are exposed to potential pathogens like breast milk, tears, saliva, and other body fluids. And in breast milk, lactoferrin suppresses iron-dependent bacteria in the gut of infants, and it helps protect them from infection. Studies have shown that lactoferrin can remove iron from tissues that are loaded with iron. Apoliactoferrin is the preferred supplemental form. It's free of iron, unlike hololactoferrin. And there are many different there are options out there. I don't have any connection or relationship with Life Extension and don't necessarily recommend this product. It just happens to be the one I could find a picture of. But you're looking for a dose of apoliactoferrin of about 300 milligrams one to two times a day between meals. That's very important. It needs to be taken between meals. Phytic acid, or inositol hexaphosphate, or IP6, as it's also known, is often referred to as an iron chelator. But while it does inhibit the absorption of iron from plant sources, it does not inhibit heme iron absorption. So heme iron is the form that's found in animal products. And most important, it does not remove iron from ferritin that's already stored in the body. So unlike lactoferrin, which can actually chelate or remove iron that's already been stored in the body, phytic acid does not do that. It just decreases the absorption of iron, and even then, only the absorption of iron in plant foods, which really doesn't make that significant of a contribution to iron stores for most people. In addition to removing accumulated iron, iron-loaded patients may need to reduce their iron intake. So this means certainly avoiding supplements with iron. It may also mean reducing intake of the most iron-rich foods. So if you look on the slide, you'll see what these are. Clams are the champion by far, with almost 24 milligrams of iron per 3-ounce serving. Oysters, 10 milligrams. Beef liver, 7 milligrams. Mussels, 5.7. Venison, 4.2. And as you'll notice, beef, just regular beef chuck, is on the list, but it's pretty far down there, and same with lamb. So, a lot of patients ask me, like, do I need to completely avoid red meat? Generally, no, because the amounts there are fairly minimal. So if they're having, relative to something like clams or oysters or even beef liver, so it really depends on the level of iron overload, how high it is, and what else they're doing to reduce iron levels. And we can't consider each individual situation, but just to point out that shellfish and organ meats are by far the highest sources of iron, and that's why I often recommend them as a part of a nutrient-dense diet. But in this case, it can work against us for people with iron overload. And then number 3 would be to cook with ceramic or stainless steel or glass instead of cast iron. They should also avoid things that enhance iron absorption. Vitamin C is one of those things, and I think it's fine in food, but I wouldn't take more than 200 milligrams of supplemental vitamin C, and I would take it between meals, so it's not helping to you're not taking it with iron-rich foods. Alcohol significantly increases iron absorption. betaine hydrochloric acid does that as well, so you want to avoid that completely. Zinc interferes with copper and iron metabolism, so avoid high doses of zinc that you would get from supplements. And then supplemental beta carotene may increase the risk of cancer in patients who have iron overload. Then there are some things that inhibit iron absorption, but these are often not that useful in my experience for the reason that, the same reason that IP6 or phytic acid is not that helpful. Most of these substances only inhibit ferrous iron. So ferrous iron is the plant-based iron, and the absorption of ferrous iron from plant foods is much lower than the absorption of heme iron from animal foods. So tannins in tea and coffee will reduce non-heme iron absorption. Oxalates from things like sweet potatoes and spinach will do that. Eggs, the avidin protein in egg whites will reduce non-heme iron absorption. Phytic acid in things like greens and nuts and legumes will do that, and phosphates will do that too. Calcium is the only dietary substance that we're aware of that has a significant impact on reducing heme and non-heme iron levels. Now, the problem with supplemental calcium, and this is a topic for another day, is that most forms of supplemental calcium have actually been shown to be harmful and increase the risk of heart disease, kidney stones, and other conditions. If you want to learn more about that, you can just Google my name and calcium. You'll see some articles that I've written. We don't have time to go into that right now. But dietary calcium can have the same effect on reducing heme iron absorption. So if someone tolerates dairy products, then eating some, drinking some kefir or eating some yogurt or even whole milk, if they tolerate that, can actually reduce calcium or reduce iron at a meal time. So that might be one strategy that's useful if they tolerate dairy. Okay, so if you'd like to learn more, chriskresser.com is my main website, and there's lots of free articles and resources there. And if you just use the search function there to search for iron, you'll find some more information on this topic. And calcium will get you some of the articles I've written on why dietary calcium has a very different effect on the body than supplemental calcium. And then if you're interested in training, that's kresserinstitute.com. I have a one-year training program for people who want to incorporate health coaching or become a health coach. And then I have a one-year training program for licensed practitioners who want to learn functional medicine. So thanks everybody for listening. And I think we have some time now for questions.
Yes, thank you, Chris. That was fantastic. Okay, so I have a question here. Is it possible to print the slides? I don't know, are we okay to send out the slides to people who registered?
That's fine. As you saw from the presentation, there's not a ton of text on the slides, but so I'm not sure how useful they'll be, but there are some of the tables, with with some the information. We can talk about that offline.
Okay. All right. And then someone's saying, how do I get genetic testing? What is the name of the tests I should request?
So there are a couple different ways to do it. Just typical labs like LabCorp or Quest have the test. It's for LabCorp. It is I can even give you the test number. I haven't checked this recently, but it used to be 511345, and it's called the hereditary hemochromatosis DNA analysis. That individual test though is pretty expensive if you're paying out of pocket. It's about $250. A more affordable way of doing it is just using a service like 23andMe, which tests up a lot of different genes and gives you a report, and they include information on the hemochromatosis mutation. That one is about $100, and a lot of people have done that as well. So different options depending on how you want to do it.
Okay, yes, that's great. And then a high liver enzyme such as AST, an ALT, an SHB, the sex hormone binding globulin, are they associated with iron overload?
Yes, not so much SHBG can go up in conditions of iron overload. It's not a classic marker, but certainly ALT and AST will go up. You'll see GGT go up as well in some cases because um, iron damages the liver. And so those aminotransferases are elevated when there's tissue breakdown happening in the liver. So sometimes that's actually because of the variability of iron markers and how they tend to go up and down. Sometimes the elevated aminotransferases are one of the first signs that we see of someone experiencing iron overload.
Okay, thank you. And then someone saying, what are the dietary sources of calcium that are recommended?
The main dietary sources of calcium are dairy products, bone-in fish, like if you get canned salmon or canned sardines or anchovies that still have the bones in them, and because they're canned, the bones are soft enough to eat. Those will be often the highest sources and also the most bioavailable sources, because as with iron, I described that the plant forms of iron are poorly absorbed compared to the animal forms. The same is true for calcium in most cases. The exception would be some of the crucifers, like broccoli, are quite high in calcium, and the absorption of the calcium is pretty high as well. Whereas in other foods like oxalates, like spinach, on paper they're very high in calcium, but the oxalate actually significantly decreases the absorption of calcium. So you will not absorb anywhere near what it says. If you look on a label, a food label, or you go to nutritiondata.com and you look at the number of milligrams of iron, you're not going to absorb anything near that because of the oxalic acid. Granted, even in dairy products and animal products, you don't absorb 100%, but you absorb a much higher rate. It's something in some cases like 30 to 40% versus like 5% in some of the plant foods. So I would say crucifers like broccoli, dairy products, if they're tolerated. So that could be yogurt, kefir, cheese, and even milk if someone tolerates that, and then bone-in fish. Like some of the higher quality canned fishes are often the best source of calcium. Now, having said that, there is one form of supplemental calcium that acts in the body like dietary calcium, and wouldn't be expected to have the negative impacts of many of the other forms of supplemental calcium, and that's bone meal. So you can now buy organic bone meal powder from pasture-raised cows from some companies. If you just Google it, you should find one. I think it's called Traditional Foods. Let me see here. Yeah, I'm not finding it, but maybe if we send something out after, I can look it up.
Okay.
But this is something I recommend to my patients, and it gets absorbed in the body like a dietary source of calcium. So that's an option for people. I often have patients who are not able to tolerate dairy. They don't eat, they can't eat bone-in fish for whatever reason, and then it can be really hard to get enough by just eating broccoli. So that's one strategy, but I find generally that if someone has iron levels, phlebotomy is the best strategy, because eating nutrient dense foods is really important. And like I said, a lot of the other foods that have significant amounts of iron also have significant levels of other nutrients too. So while someone who has classic hemochromatosis might need to avoid shellfish and organ meats, I generally don't recommend that for someone who just has mild iron overload because of how many other beneficial nutrients those foods contain.
Okay, yes, that's great. Thank you, Chris. And another question, where did you get the optimal ferritin reference ranges of 50 to 150?
Those are not optimal. Those are what is recommended by groups like the Iron Disorders Institute as targets for treatment. So I mentioned optimal, I think, is probably below 150 or 200 for men, and maybe 125 or 100 for women. And that's based on all of the studies that I presented in the presentation that show an increase in the risk of various diseases as ferritin goes above those numbers. And as I mentioned in the presentation as well, groups like the Iron Disorders Institute have advocated for lower ferritin levels as well. So there's a lot of information out there that supports these findings.
Mm. And can a person give blood regularly whilst also taking apoplectin ferrin to lower blood iron?
That all depends on their levels. Like if someone is engaging in therapeutic phlebotomy, or blood donation, they need to have their levels monitored regularly, because you don't want to go too far in the other direction and induce, significant iron deficiency. And so, if we have a patient that needs more aggressive support and we decide to give them apolipoferrin and also do phlebotomy, then we're going to be monitoring their iron levels regularly to make sure that they're not dropping too low.
Okay. And then is it necessary to get a genetic test for hemochromatosis if, for example, they have, a paternal grandparent or somebody, a close relative, had died from it?
It still is probably a good idea, because especially if it was a grandparent, because there's no guarantee that if your grandparent, even if they were homozygous, that you have two copies of those genes, because you would have, if it was your mom's father, for example, you still have your father's genes and you don't know anything about what those were. So yes, I think the genetic testing is even more helpful, actually. And I would kind of turn that question around and say, if you do have a relatively close relative that has died from hemochromatosis complications, I would absolutely recommend getting a genetic test, because it just makes it more, more likely that that's a possibility.
Oh, okay, yeah, and that makes sense, of course. And then another question has come in: the possible correlation stroke cause of normal iron levels and high normal ferritin levels at the top end, or I'm not sure if I'm at the top end of normal. Okay, I don't know if you can see the questions in the chat box there. Does that one make sense to you?
Let me check it out.
Yeah.
Here.
Okay. The possible color. Yeah, we see that one.
I do. Okay, so high ferritin with normal iron levels can be one of two things. It can be either early stage iron overload, because ferritin is the storage form of iron, so the body will sometimes pack away or store away excess iron in ferritin, so you'll see that go up first. Or it can also mean inflammation. As I mentioned before, ferritin is an acute phase reactant, so it will often go up even if iron levels are normal, because of inflammation. And that's where the soluble transferrin marker can be really helpful, because it is not affected by inflammation. And so it can help distinguish between iron overload that's caused by inflammation and high ferritin that's caused by inflammation and high ferritin that's caused by iron overload.
Okay, and I'm sure you can see the questions coming in, and we are running to the top of the hour.
I can just read them if you want. Yeah.
All right.
So a minimal optimal value for ferritin, less than 150 at the high end, or 200 maybe for men. Yes, of course, there's a minimal level as well, and that will depend on the situation, because the minimum then gets to iron deficiency. And the minimum might be a little different in a woman who is dealing with hypothyroidism, for example, because we know that slightly higher ferritin levels will benefit women typically who have Hashimoto's or hypothyroidism, and then in a male, for example. But generally, the optimal range that we use for a woman for ferritin might be somewhere between 30 and 100. and then, you know, with some accounting, as I mentioned, for different situations depending on their health status and their goals. And then for men, it might also it might be more like 30 or maybe 25 to 150, 175. So you have to look at this. You have to remember, like, when you're looking at lab work, you're never just looking at one marker. You have to always consider lab markers in the context of other markers. So it's kind of hard sometimes to answer these questions because you're looking at the whole picture and not just a single marker. Okay, last question. I'm not clear on that, but I think if the question is if the 23andMe was done years ago, you should be able to just log in and check your hemochromatosis status. They've updated their reporting recently. So I think that is sort of like backwards compatible with, because they still have the genetic sequence, so they just apply it to that.
Oh, thank you, Chris. That was fantastic. As you can see, lots of questions coming in, so this was a very enjoyable topic, and we appreciate you very much for being with us today. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please mark your calendars for March 14th, next month. We will be having Stephanie Novinskas. She will be doing Storytelling Secrets, how to give your small business a big voice with storytelling. So thank you, everybody. Everyone who's registered today will get a recording within the next 24 hours.
Thank you, Andrea.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris. All right. Bye-bye.